I am delighted now to introduce Representative Trey Sherwood, who will deliver our keynote presentation. Representative Sherwood serves in the Wyoming House of Representatives, representing House District 14, which includes much of the city of Laramie and Albany County. Representative Sherwood is the director of Downtown Laramie, where she coordinates a wide range of economic development, historic preservation, promotion, public art, and fundraising activities. A good friend of the humanities over much time. Sherwood has an MA in public history and a BA in history, photography, and English. She's co-founder of the Laramie Mural Project and the Laramie Public Art Coalition, and has served as a board member for the Wyoming State Historical Society, the Laramie Plains Museum, and was president of the Albany County Historical Society. Please help me welcome Representative Sherwood.
Thank you. It feels weird to say today I'm your keynote speaker because I have definitely learned more from you than you will from me. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for diving in to have difficult conversations, to be in uncomfortable spaces, and to come out and be able to communicate what you are learning and what you're doing. It has filled my cup, and I can say that I am a more intelligent, thoughtful human being after listening to you today. So thank you all so much for sharing of yourself and your time and resources. I do not represent myself as a politician. I actually think that's a very dirty word. I'd much rather consider myself to be a public servant. I love community building. And on good days, I would consider myself to be a stateswoman. And in Wyoming, that means a unicorn, because I am part of the minority party. So not only am I younger than the average age in the House or the Senate, my gender sets me apart, my position as a Democrat sets me apart. But I actually think that makes the work more enjoyable to be the underdog. So I wanted to share with you guys a little bit just about my past, my history, my journey, and where I'm trying to show up in the world, but would also want to leave time for dialogue and communication. So I'm a proud Air Force brat. My father was in the military. His father before him was in the Navy. The story goes that my dad was driving truck for the Jolly Green Giant in Blue Earth, Minnesota, and he proposed to my mother, and she said, "Not until you get a real job." And so he went off and joined the Air Force and called her from boot camp and said, "How about now?" And his first assignment was overseas to England. And it was the very first time my mother had been on an airplane when she flew over to join him after their wedding. So grew up a little bit of everywhere across the United States. I had the benefit of being part of very diverse communities in the K through 12 system. Normally on Air Force bases, white students are the minority. And I thought that was fine and normal. And I was always excited when a new family member moved onto the block to say like, "Ooh, what kind of food are we going to get to try now?" And, food is that equalizer of breaking bread together and building community. And so it wasn't until my father retired, we moved outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And I started my junior year at a new high school. It was the first high school I had attended that was off of the base. And I can very traumatically still remembering walking into the cafeteria and having a crisis of, where do I sit? Because I was presented with self-segregation. All of the white students were on one side of the room. All of the African-American students were on the other side of the room. And I was blown away by how bizarre this site was. So needless to say, that junior year was a little bit challenging for myself and my brother, who was coming in as a freshman. And it was a lot to navigate. Most Air Force, military families are very close knit, like this traditional, you help out your neighbor, no questions asked, sort of thing. The other context that I was missing in the world was this idea of politics. My mom had a rule that was, there's no conversation about politics at the dinner table. I asked her about this week. I said, "Mom, do you remember this?" She's like, "Yeah, I just didn't want fighting at the table. It was like the one quiet moment that we could have as a family." And she goes, "Do you also remember my rule about not talking about the neighbor's wife?" I was, "No, I don't remember that rule." And so I did not know until I was way into adulthood. My parents were Republicans. I had no idea because we just didn't talk about it. And I don't think I ever had a concept of how politics can present itself as an influencer over our lives until I was 13 years old. And I very distinctly remember babysitting. This is on the Air Force Base, babysitting a neighbor's family, not realizing at the time they were probably at a convention or a caucus or a watch party. It's 1992, and Bill Clinton won and defeated the incumbent Bush, and the parents coming home in tears, an absolute emotional agony over the election results. And I was absolutely confused as to how an election could cause so much heartache in this family. And so I went home and I asked my parents, I said, what is going on? Why is this such a big deal? And at the time, whether it was true or perceived, a fear or reality, the idea that a Democratic president was going to be less supportive of the military. And so families who were struggling to put food on the table and struggling to feel that their profession would be respected and protected felt very unsure in that moment. And that was my first realization of, wow, politics has a personal impact on our lives. So, going through my formative years, after high school, I decided I wanted to go to school to study history, but I didn't want to teach. So there was that sort of head scratching moment until I saw a poster in the hallway that said, do you love history, but you don't want to teach? Try public history. I'm like, yes, that's it. That's what I want to do. And so North Georgia, dry county, very small class size. I think I had 13 in my graduating class. Just fell in love with how humanities can present itself as a tool of understanding and taking our history and presenting it in a way, whether it's in oral history or in exhibits or storytelling, feels more relevant and meaningful to our lives today. And so after I got my degree, so that was in 2004, Georgia was cutting back on museums, humanities, whether it was economy or political. And so I decided to cast a wide net, and I applied for over 50 positions all over the world. Air Force brat, I can travel, change is great. And I got a call from the director of the Wyoming Territorial Prison State Historic Site on the day that I was graduating. And he said, would you like to come interview? And I said, remind me what job this is, because I had forgotten I had applied for so many things. So my roommate at the time was from a small community in Tennessee. She had never been on a plane. So we both flew out to Denver, got lost on the way to Laramie. I got to interview. People said, you look so European. Where are your jeans? And I got offered the job, and I went home and packed up my things and moved west. And I had never been to Wyoming before, landed here in the community, had the great pleasure of being the historian at the Territorial Prison for 5 years, where I got to meet and fall in love with my favorite historical leader, Mae Preston Slauson. So she was the first woman in the United States to get a PhD from Cornell University. She married Edwin Slauson, who came to the university to teach, was a geologist. Her and her family lived at the corner of Grand and 9th. And she started volunteering at the prison, reading letters that the inmates were receiving for those inmates who were not literate and were having trouble with correspondence. She felt it was really important to their family members. So she volunteered there at the prison, and the chaplain at the time moved on, retired. And the story goes, so I have her journal, newspaper articles, that the warden asked the inmates, boys, who do you want to be your spiritual leader? And they all said, Miss Mae Preston Slauson. And so it was the first time in United States history that a female was a prison chaplain. And so there are great documents about her role in working with the inmates through that. She had an amazing support system. Her father had been a pastor. Her mother was really progressive. And so the day that the warden rode to her house with his carriage and said, May, the boys are asking for you. They want you to serve in this role. She was a little bit like, I have 2 young kids at home. Is this appropriate for a woman to do? And her mom said, May, I want you to enter every open door, every opportunity I want you to take, right? So her mother stayed home with the kids so that she could go do this work at the prison. And her story was incredibly inspiring to me as somebody who was, out on my own and trying to find my place in the world. And so I've been able to reconnect with her as a legislator. I'm on the Capitol Exhibit and Wayfinding Committee. And so we're talking about suffrage and how do we tell the story at the state capitol. So I was able to dig back into some of my research about Mae Preston Slauson and wanted to share with you guys this story. So she and her husband moved to New York in 1903 when the prison closed, and she became active in the suffrage movement. So in 1869, women could vote. So she moves to New York, 1903. She doesn't have what she considers that basic human right. And it's annoying, and rightfully so. She decides to act on that annoyance. So she is invited to speak at a women's suffrage meeting and unfortunately falls ill, but sends a message with her husband. So the story goes, Mrs. Mae Preston Slauson was down for a speech because she has voted in Wyoming prior. She was ill, so she made a perfectly natural Wyoming equal suffrage arrangement and told the audience that, and sent Mr. Mae Preston Slauson, his other name was not given, to speak in her place. This font is really tiny. So then Mr. Slauson is described as a big man and looked as if he might hold his own in a domestic arrangement. But he told the audience that Mrs. Slauson was really the speaker of his house. And Mrs. Slauson made a wise choice of a substitute, for Mr. Slauson made a speech that carried off the honors of the evening, saying, I would like to have had Mrs. Slauson tell you of the emotions of a woman who has voted 3 times for president. Said Mr. Slauson, you would not be interested in hearing what a man felt. Then I would like to have you see that she is entirely unspoiled by having gone through the process and endured the ordeal. In fact, it hasn't hurt any of the women. You never hear women suffrage talked about in Wyoming. The women don't talk, they vote. And it is a great deal more effective. I would advise you to do that here in New York. He also goes on to say that there's no use for lapdogs in their house because his wife is so active. So just a charming little story. And so when I was accepted into Leadership Wyoming in 2009, and one of the class assignments was to reflect on somebody you admire, I picked her, and I just continued to think about her life and how it intersected and inspired moments in my own life. And I think the exercise was meant to be somebody who was still with us, but I will say that she is my historical crush. And I just wanted to share with you guys a little story about Mae Preston Slauson. How many of you guys have heard about her before? So 2 over here, right? So there's still more amazing first for women in Wyoming stories to tell. If you get a chance, please stop by the Wyoming Women's History House in downtown Laramie. They have new exhibits that are much more rich and in-depth than they've been in the past. So if you went and were disappointed, please give it a second chance. Or if you haven't been, go and hang out and learn more about our first for women in Wyoming. So yes, Leadership Wyoming, 2009, that really gave me an opportunity to fall deeply, deeply in love with the state of Wyoming. So if you're not familiar with the format, you take a year with a class around 40 people. It's very purposely, very diverse backgrounds, age, industry perspectives other than your own. And you go each month to a new community and you learn about what makes that community tick, whether it's their economy, the education system, government, whatever it is. So you have internal reflection on your leadership skills and outward learning and appreciation for what makes Wyoming this dynamic, rich place. And at that time, 2009, I was like, I want to run for office. This is amazing. I love this place. I love the state. How do I get involved? How do I make a difference? Well, my day job at the time that I started in 2010, so 14 years, just crazy to say. I've been the director for Laramie Main Street Alliance. We're a nonprofit, 501c3. When I started, I was the only employee. And I love the work deeply, but it didn't allow me to step away and say, I want to run for office. I was the only person. And so I just kept that desire sort of in my pocket and started to become more involved in community through Main Street. So just a quick overview, we're grassroots, community-driven. Everything we do is about what the community needs or wants to see happen in our historic district. So it's 28 blocks. I have 300 locally owned businesses that I consider to be my babies. I love them. I fiercely support them. We do farmers market. We do public art, fundraising to pay for all of this. And this week we're hosting the International Flavor Festival. How many of you guys have eaten out downtown this week? Okay. How many of you guys have heard of the International Flavor Festival? Okay, great. So this is our third annual. And this is my favorite. I think I say this every time, favorite new event. But the purposefulness behind it, we decided to use storytelling as an economic development tool and as a town and gown tool. So reaching out to the international students on campus, asking them to share food culture, memories, recipes, anything that they just had a strong emotional tie to, share those with us through stories. And then we asked the same of our international community members who may not have a direct tie to the university. We gathered all of these stories and then we shared them with our restaurants downtown and said, please adopt a dish based on a story that you find inspirational. So every menu item that's out there this week, there are 24 restaurants participating. Some of them have 1, 2, or 3 countries they've adopted. Every menu item represents a person in our community. And by telling that story, we're creating a broader definition of community. And we're seeing international students in our downtown, which we usually don't see. And that's something that has bothered us for a long time as an organization. And so that's happening this week. And it's just been magical to be in community, to be in communion, to break bread with people, to learn their stories, their culture, their history. And at the same time, thank you all who've eaten out, because you're spending a lot more money than our restaurants usually see this time of year. So it is generating additional revenue through our community as well. So that's a little tidbit of the Main Street work that I get to do. And I am so incredibly fortunate to be in community daily and to hear from my neighbors, their needs, their desires, their wants. And during the pandemic, all of our summer events got canceled. So I had a bunch of free time. And at that point, I also had 2 part-time employees. So I had people to be in the space and to continue the work. And so I went to my board and said, I want to run. I'm ready to do this. Here's the window. And Representative Dan Furphy, who'd been my House representative, decided to run for the Senate. So I also didn't have an incumbent to run after. And it just felt like, as odd as it to say, I decided to run for office during COVID, the stars aligned and opened up that door of opportunity. And I took Miss Mae Preston Slauson's mother's advice and I walked through that door. And so, yeah, I campaigned, door knocked, did all the work during the pandemic. And I can say door knocking is the most incredible way to get to know your community. I just took the approach of, I'm here to listen, right? What are your needs? What are your concerns? What are your pain points? Let me soak it all in and try to take that and represent that in Cheyenne. So I was fortunate enough to get elected. I didn't know until after the campaign that I am the first woman and the first Democrat to hold this specific seat since 1992. So this is traditionally a red district, and maybe I've turned it purple. So on to my legislative journey. I don't know yet that I've had enough time to reflect, right? Nor do I know, I don't have the long view of people say it's worse now than it's ever been. I don't have that context. I just have what I have today to respond to. But I tell people when I'm in the building, which is a very humbling experience to work in the state capitol, that my superpower is my rose-colored glasses, that I am a closet pessimist. I'm a very open optimist, and I try to see the best in everybody in all situations. And so when I'm meeting and greeting colleagues on the floor, we have a great tradition where we start the day with greetings and hugs and hellos, and we all go around and have, face-to-face time. I start that with optimism, and I'm assuming that everyone in that space is there because they deeply love their communities and they have a desire to serve their constituents. And so far, that tool has served me well. I do have a few nicks on my rose-colored glasses, but I'm going to hold on to them fiercely for as long as possible. My husband is the cynic in the family, so I let him play that role. But I have the pleasure of learning and loving and serving you all at the state capitol. I feel like my gut says I'm going to pause now and just take questions. I'd rather be in conversation with you all. So.
Thank you, Representative Trey. I have a question about something that John mentioned in his speech concerning satire and the consumption of media in an age where we have a constant stream of information from many different angles. Where do you get your news for local, state, and national politics, and why?
Awesome question. Thank you. So I am very much focused on hyperlocal, right? So I still read the Laramie Boomerang. We talked about that in a sidebar conversation. I subscribe to the Laramie Reporter, so shout out to Jeff Victor. I look at the UW Branding Iron. I read Wyophile, Cowboy State Daily, Tribune. I try to just to consume as much from as many local Wyoming news sources as possible. I don't watch television, and I don't really prioritize following the national headlines. I think that has helped for my own mental health, because I have a circle of influence in terms of what I can contribute and control to my community and state. So I don't feel the need to get all wrapped up in what's going on at a national level. I tend to not, like, my Instagram feed is all like puppy training videos, right? I don't do like news through Facebook or social media, again, like boundaries, mental health. But I also am hyper aware, I think, with my humanities background, of the echo chamber that exists, and making sure I'm making room for ideas that make me feel uncomfortable, like reading headlines that I'm like, oh God, I don't understand that. Like, let me take space to approach it. I should also say that not only are my parents Republicans, my husband and his family are Republicans. So I'm the only Democrat in my immediate family. And so I'm so thankful. Like, we have actually healthy conversations around the dinner table. And a lot of times I'll say, I don't understand why XYZ. Could you please explain it to me? And I have a great circle of people around me who I trust that think very differently than me. So fortunate in that way. And to hear their perspective on the issue, and again, trying to come from a place of understanding. So.
Your presentation was very enlightening from the standpoint of the focus that you have is local, and it's always to listen to your people. And I felt we had a lot of that from the people this morning. The material that we heard, they all said, we're still working on this. Things have to be, more work to be done. But is there a way, a forum, a platform, a place that you could recommend? Scott's not going to like this, but you take his show on the road, for want of a better expression. There's too much thought to be left in this room. And if others in your legislative community were to hear what they're finding from the people they're interacting with, the people that are feeding their research, maybe it would help broaden their perspectives. Is there any forum like that would be possible? Or is it too high level?
So what I learned today is anything is possible. And my first thought was, just come to the Capitol. I'll rent a room and we can all just hang out. And yes, you're right. And I asked Scott as an aside, like, what's next? Like, are there alumni gatherings, people coming back together? Is it publication? Like, how does the research and the information continue? And while it is true that I would love to see all of you at the Capitol, whether it's in the galleries or in front of us testifying, I I'm going to take it a little bit different direction here in terms of having these conversations in community. The term third space, is anybody familiar with that? Okay. So for your first space is your home. Your second space is your workplace. Your third space is when you're out in community. And so that can be as simple as a park, a brewery, a coffee shop, a bowling alley. And I know I'm taking this a totally different direction, but having the conversations we had today and sharing out the takeaways we had today in third spaces, in community, I think is really powerful. And it gets to the grassroots impact of the work that the humanities can have. And so maybe it's not a formal conference, although I think that's great as well. I think it's, I feel like a pastor now saying this, but I love my pastor at Trinity Lutheran. Nate is amazing. Taking it out into the world, taking out the word, the message of the Spirit out into the world. So beyond this room today, what can we all do to share how we've been inspired or what we've learned? And I think that is like reflecting with people next time you go and sit at a park or walk your dog or grab a cup of coffee to say, hey, I was at this really amazing forum, and these are the things that I heard, and let the conversation continue in those spaces.
For the record, I love that idea. A flower becomes a garden, becomes a meadow, becomes a forest, becomes a beautiful green world. Like, you have a question for Representative? You have another one. Okay, I'm going to go to someone who hasn't asked a question first, but then you can have it. Hold tight. Remember your question. Yes.
Thank you for joining us today. My question is, how was your thinking challenged today?
No, I absolutely appreciate that. I took notes, but I think one of the things that is top of mind right now is sometimes I do hide behind the idea of a moderate or a boring politician, and that there are times I'm hesitant to create waves, take a side, lean into what can be considered controversial. And I know that that's a weakness in my own leadership, or maybe it's a strategy at times. And so I feel like I'm going to do some hard work in reflecting about the ideas that you guys shared, in understanding how I show up as a public servant in the state house on behalf of those whose voices aren't heard. And that the nuance that you created about not speaking for someone, providing them a space to speak, which I can say is challenging. When we're on the floor debating, that's not built into our process, which is a huge flaw in the process. And so being mindful about X issue may not be the thing that I am sleepless about, but if a community member that's their heartbreak, I need to be brave enough to take that to the mic and speak that.
So you mentioned a little earlier that you go to Trinity Lutheran Church here in Laramie. Awesome. So I'm a Christian, and I'm very interested in the interplay between religion and politics, because it's super important. And I feel like it has either plagued or blessed this country in a number of ways. And so my question for you is, how do you feel your faith in Christ as a Lutheran has impacted your outlook politically and policy-making wise as a representative?
Thank you so much for that question. I think about that quite a bit. I would say everything I have learned about social justice, I have learned in the pew. And so I feel incredibly blessed that every pastor, every spiritual leader I've had has been fiercely dedicated to service and to fighting injustice and thinking about like the greater good of humanity. And so it is jarring when I meet other individuals with a religious belief that clashes with my experience. It's like again, that sitting in that uncomfortable space and trying to understand, like, well, when you heard the sermon, you heard take away rights. And when I heard the sermon, I heard increase rights. Like, those are really squishy, challenging conversations. The other thing that I found sort of strange is this idea that because I'm a Democrat, I can't be religious, and that my colleagues have been shocked that I pray. That's been really strange. It kind of flies in the face of the separation of church and state, but we do have a prayer every morning. And we have a different pastor from all over Wyoming with a different spiritual background come in Monday through Thursday to pray for us. And then we have our greeting. And so I think of it as like, peace be with you, peace be with you. And you walk around and you say hello, because that's what you do at church. Strange. I don't know where that tradition came from. I know it makes some of my colleagues uncomfortable because you're on the floor and you cannot remove yourself from that space during that prayer. And I realize that's not fair for everyone. But on Fridays, we have somebody from the floor go to the mic and say the blessing or the prayer or whatever to start the day. And the speaker last year said, "Hey, will you do it?" And so I went up, said whatever at the mic. And I had so many people come up to me afterwards. They're like, "We didn't know you were religious. We didn't know you had a faith tradition. We didn't and I was like, oh gosh, I don't know if that's a badge of armor that I'm like keeping it separate, or if that's something I should be ashamed of because it wasn't apparent in how I was showing up." But again, for me, my faith, my religion is about community and service. And so it's with me every day when I'm in making decisions on the floor about policy, right? But I do believe in the separation of church and state. So I don't feel like religious dogma should drive policy, but I believe the care and feeding of human beings should drive policy.
Well, I loved seeing the Park County representation in the La Faena Espanol, and I moved here from Cody just this fall. So I guess my question is more on behalf of the people zooming in. Is in Laramie, we're really fortunate to just be a quick jump away from the State House. But how would you get involved? How would you encourage people to get involved and show up when they can't necessarily drive to the Capitol to testify or to sit in the balcony? Because in Cody, I was more cared about what was happening in Montana than in Cheyenne, to be honest. So it's really fascinating to be so close now. So for people far away, how do you get involved?
Oh, that's awesome. I love that question. So one thing, you don't have to wait till we're in session. If wherever you're at in your community, whoever your representative is, you can call them up and be like, let's have coffee. Let's take our dogs for a walk. Let's sit down and have a conversation. I want to share with you about what's important to me. So actually meeting one-on-one outside of session, you'll probably get a more attentive interaction. During session, it is absolutely chaotic. And I would say email, and make sure you're not using a click, fill out the form type of email. Send a personal email and keep it short and sweet to the point. Most of our phone numbers are on the website, so you can call or text us at any time. Obviously, if we're on the floor, we can look at a text a lot quicker than waiting for a break and checking a phone call. But I can say, I think two things are way more powerful than I realized. One, when members of our communities are up in the gallery and we get a chance to say hello and recognize you, it improves our behavior on the floor because we know that you're there and you're watching, and that there's a little bit of like humbleness, take the drama down a notch that happens, especially if you bring your children. It's awesome to have kids in the gallery. The other thing is the power of showing up to testify in person, which I know not everyone can. So some committees will say, we'll take public comment first, and then we'll do comment on Zoom. Some will limit that structure. Each committee chair can decide what that looks like. But if you can show up in person, your testimony matters so much. I have seen committees flip on an issue because they heard directly from their constituents. I have seen individuals who said, my moral compass says I should vote this way. My party tells me I should vote this way. But the public testimony in the room gave them the cover and the courage to vote their conscience. It matters. Your voice in the process matters. And so whatever way is most accessible to you, please use it. If you're not hearing from your representative in the House or the Senate, go a little farther out. right? So here in Albany County, if somebody calls up and says, hey, I have an issue with this liquor law and I'm a constituent in the county over, I don't care. I love hearing from Wyomingites voicing a concern. And then if I don't have expertise in that problem solving area, I'll reach out to the senator, the House member, across the way and say like, hey, you have expertise in this issue. Can you help me problem solve? So don't let your interaction be limited to just your House member, your senator member. You can also connect with people based on like a shared knowledge base as well. And my philosophy, I really wish that we could do this. I wish that we could have an app. Okay. Whoever is out there listening who's good with computers, like Lucas thing, right? I wish that somebody could help us with an app that like streamline our emails to say like, this is a constituent. This is somebody in your community. This is somebody in Wyoming. This is an outside of state lobbyist trying to influence you. Junk mail, right? I wish that we had a filter on that. So we don't. So again, during session, we're getting like hundreds of emails a day. And so even if you take the time to email, also take the time to call, send a postcard, send a text, right? And check in. So thank you. One more. Do you have a dog? Can we schedule a time to walk dogs together?
I don't have a dog.
Okay. Please adopt one.
I know somebody who can get you a dog. There's a CEO of an animal shelter, 2 people down from you who can get you a dog.
Oh man.
Walk and talk. Walk and talk with the dogs.
So I live in university housing, so that wouldn't work, unfortunately. But someday I hope to build a tiny house and have all sorts of animals. But so my third question, and I know I've been asking a lot, but this has been really fascinating. I really appreciate your willingness to have this public engagement. So my question is about something you just mentioned earlier, was like outside lobby groups, right? How money corrupts and influence policymakers on all levels, including even in the state house in Wyoming. So my question is, have you ever felt pressure either from either the Democratic Party in Wyoming or from lobbyists within or without the state to take a certain stance that was against your constituents' values? And how did you approach that situation? How did you respond to it?
Again, wonderful question. And I have the great pleasure of saying, no, I've not been in that situation, which is why I still think that there is hope and civility and a way forward for Wyoming to be this like shining example of how democracy can work. So one, as a Democrat, I have never felt pressured by my party to think a certain way, to speak a certain way, to vote a certain way. And I wish that my Republican colleagues had that same experience. I don't see that happening, and it breaks my heart that they are getting a completely different type of pressure around messaging and how to vote. So as an underdog, I have a ton of freedom to constantly think about my constituents before my party. And in terms of our lobbyists, we are also still very unique that our lobbyists are our experts. And if there is an issue that I do not understand, say gaming in Wyoming, gambling in Wyoming, which is an interim topic, I can call up our industry leaders, our lobbyists, and we have a relationship of just the facts, right? Here is the data. Here's what the statute says, how we're interpreting it. Here's the, economic impact on this issue, whatever it is, best practices research. And so we are still so fortunate in Wyoming, at least for our, and I'm speaking of lobbyists who are registered living in Wyoming, that they are trusted sources to give us the facts and the data. And then it's up to us as individuals to say, all right, now that I've got the information in front of me, again, what does this mean for my constituents and my community? I have never had a lobbyist pressure me to vote a certain way. Yeah, isn't that amazing? They ask nicely. Yes, some lobbyists ask nicely, but I've never felt like you have to do this.
Trey, I wonder, I'm from Laramie County, and I work as part of the Laramie County Democratic Party. And earlier today, we heard Lucas say that many Democrats in the state are either switching their registration or they're just not re-registering to vote. So we're not seeing them on our voter registration numbers anymore. How do you speak to Democrats outside of your community in the state of Wyoming who are feeling that sense of fear, who are feeling that total sense of disenfranchisement, that there is no representation, there is no voice for them. You have a little bit of a pocket here in Albany County. But what would you recommend some of us do, or what would you say to people who have Democratic leaning, left leaning values in other parts of the states and are really feeling like they don't have a voice and really fearful of expressing that sense of values in any way?
Thank you for that. And I think this has been something that's been on my mind since was there a story in the New York? There was a story recently about what it's like to be a Democrat in Wyoming and that fear-based. And I guess to, again, put on my rose-colored glasses and like flip the narrative a little bit, I would say honesty is a shared value, I think, across political spectrums in Wyoming. And I've had colleagues far, far, far right come up to me and say, I respect you because you are honest about your beliefs. You don't pretend to be something that you're not. Even though I don't agree with you on most issues, the fact that you are brave enough to register and serve as a Democrat means that you are being true and authentic to yourself. And I hope that other Democrats may have a similar experience in their own community of showing up in a way that translates as honest and authentic, even in the face of being the underdog and being maybe the only one, who shows up for a convention meeting or. But the other part of that is, and this is where I'll push back on that article that said it had a negative tone to like, what does it mean to be a Wyoming Democrat? I do think there's a difference to say like a Democrat in California is different than a Democrat in Wyoming. I think that's okay, right? To show up in communities where you are the underdog and say, let's focus on our shared values of honesty, hard work, freedom, our love of our lands, our public lands, and instead of in community, our deep love of community, right? And instead of doing the label game, I guess I'm being a little Pollyanna here. It's hard. It's absolutely hard. But I think people are looking for bravery and honesty, and for people to stand outside of their comfort zones and say, even in the face of this hard work, we can still make a difference. And that we probably need to do a better job of coming together at a statewide level to support and love on each other, because that work is hard. Showing up in community is hard. I'm going to keep thinking about this. That's a good one.
So I'm hoping this question can allow you to use your superpower of your rose-colored glasses. I'm wondering for you, what would it mean for Wyoming to become more democratic? And I don't mean more blue. I mean democracy with the lowercase d. So, like, what would it look like or consist of for Wyoming to become more democratic?
That's an awesome question too. I think policies around like public participation and public comment period need to be more generous, right? And so whether it's and I'm speaking from like a member of the House, as we're out in communities and doing our interim work, we need to prioritize more time on our agendas and more time in community, so that we are hearing not just this echo chamber of ourselves speaking to each other, but are constantly flooded with information from our constituents and our community members. So right now, you could have a whole day-long meeting and only have 15 minutes scheduled for public comment. Like, that's broken. But I also think about, we are a citizen legislature, meaning that we're part-time. So I have the benefit of having a job that's here for me after session. I take unpaid leave and I move to Cheyenne to serve so I can be 100% focused in that work. Not everyone has that ability. If you're a young family, if you are lower economic status, most of our Wyoming representatives are retired, independently flexible with their wealth. And so we see less nuance in life experiences and perspectives and voices. And it's a tough one to think about, like, should we become a full-time should we become full-time politicians? So it's a job and it pays. We would get different people who would probably run and be able to serve, but we really pride ourselves in being citizen legislature and going back into our community and working and serving so that we're constantly hearing from our community members. I don't know which direction is right to go. But I also think things like the way that we elect our officials, like ranked choice voting. Like I mentioned, that I'm the first woman in Dem to be in the seat since 1992. Well, the difference was prior to 1990, you could pick like, oh, I want this person as my first choice. This person is my second choice. And guess what? Way more women were elected to office. There are more women serving in Wyoming in the 80s than there are today. So also the way that we elect people to go and speak for us, I think needs to change. So those are just 3 things off the top of my mind. Thank you for that question.